Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman, so this is an interesting turnabout in play. The political right had been tamping down at best and completely dismissing in the main the idea that Russia was messing with the U.S. election. What do you believe right now, and what are you trying to do?
Well, and this is very astounding because on the intelligence committees where we've been briefed on this, there's really no disagreement between Democrats and Republicans that the Russians were hacking our institutions and dumping information. Indeed, that's the broad consensus of the intelligence community. You don't get a statement like we had weeks ago from the Director of National Intelligence expressing not only that the Russians were hacking, but it could not except come from the highest levels of the Kremlin unless they have a lot of confidence in that assessment. So I'm glad to see Lindsey Graham step forward and call for an investigation of this. This is something I think the country needs to know about more. I'm urging that the entire Congress be briefed, not just the members of the intelligence committees, so that all members can share the understanding that we have.
And I have reporting as well that backs up the assertion that the Russians had a hand in the hacks and what we saw with WikiLeaks. The President-elect of the United States does not believe it. He thinks you're playing politics. Donald Trump has said as much, and he doesn't want to hear it from you even now. We have been reading. Can you confirm that the President-elect doesn't want any briefings from the House Intelligence Committee about what they believe about Russian intervention?
Well, I can certainly tell you that the President-elect has been briefed, and so it's very disturbing to me that even hearing from our intelligence officials about their confidence in the assessment of Russian hacking of our institutions, the President-elect is still willing to go before the public and say he doesn't think this really happened. To me, Chris, it's very much like the tweet he sent out saying that millions of illegal immigrants voted. This is someone who just cannot accept the fact that he may have benefited from Russian intervention. Look, he won the election. We're not disputing that he won the Electoral College, but he ought to acknowledge Russian interference in our country because it may have benefited him this time, but if he crosses Russia, and ultimately he'll have to because the Russians are not our friends, then he may be the subject of similar hacks, and I would hate to wait for that point to try to establish some kind of a deterrent.
Well, taking one more step down the road of playing politics with this, so you're going to investigate. What do you think you could really find, and what could you do about it anyway?
Well, I think we can both prepare ourselves to resist Russian interference in the future by informing the public. Part of the issue, I think, here during the presidential campaign is that we need to get better information out to the country to know that there was an attempt by the Russians to manipulate our political processes. That's part of inoculating ourselves against Russian interference. But more than calling them out, exposing their malevolence, helps to deter the Russians. It's not enough, and I also think we ought to be sanctioning Russia for their interference in our political affairs and that of our European allies. But these are all very important steps to take going forward.
What are you hearing from your brothers and sisters on the Democratic side about the military choices to Donald Trump's cabinet?
Well, I think most of us like General Kelly. He has a very good reputation. We want to know more about his views on immigration and some of the issues he hasn't directly confronted, or at least not to the degree he will at the Department of Homeland Security. I like General Mattis very much. I like how he's pushed back on the torture issue. I like how he's, frankly, very tough on Russia, and I hope we'll talk some sense in the President-elect, and very strongly supportive of NATO. We are concerned, though, with appointing so many generals, and this, I think, is directly implicated in that statutory prohibition on filling the slot at Secretary of Defense with a recently retired military officer.
But that was 1946 when that was passed, right? It was a very different time in our history.
Well, it certainly was passed a long time ago, but it has stood the test of time. The principle of civilian leadership of the military was important then. It's important now. And in fact, Chris, given the open-ended authorization to use military force, unfortunately, that still remains in effect, notwithstanding mine and other efforts to repeal that and replace it with something. That is an open door to the next President and Secretary of Defense to broadly engage military forces, and I think heightens the need to have some commitment to civilian control of that institution, even greater in the face of that wide-open AUMF.
Is there any real chance that the law is not waived, the law that restricts military membership in the cabinet to somebody who's been retired for 7 years?
Look, I think Republicans are all going to support a waiver, and even among Democrats, a lot of us have such great admiration for General Mattis. We're going to be inclined to support a waiver, but the more the president-elect fills his cabinet with other generals, the graver the concerns that we have, and that, frankly, is giving me a lot of heartburn about a waiver that initially I've been very inclined to want to support. He's considering other generals for key positions like Secretary of State, like the Director of National Intelligence, and should he populate his entire cabinet this way, that I think will put more question in terms of Democrats on whether to support the waiver.
Congressman, thank you for your perspective on New Day this morning.